Aloha, everyone. I'm your Van Dyken, MD. I'm a surgeon by trade, but my true passion is helping people just like you obtain and maintain optimum health. If you've been with us for a little while, I've posted a few videos and interviews discussing nitric oxide. I'll link those videos in the description below. Today, I've been so fortunate to have a discussion with Bryan, PhD. Dr. Bryan has spent his entire career studying nitric oxide, and he's currently an adjunct professor at the Baylor College of Medicine. In addition to this, he's an avid researcher and has made seminal discoveries in the nitric oxide field, which have resulted in dozens of US and international patents related to nitric oxide. He's the co-founder of a company called humanN, as well as a line of nitric oxide products called N101. And if this isn't enough, he's a prolific writer. He's authored 5 books, including one titled The Nitric Oxide NO Solution. He's also authored multiple papers on nitric oxide, which have been highly cited. In this interview, we discuss a spectrum of nitric oxide topics, including the study Dr. Bryan is spearheading, which looks at nitric oxide lozenges and COVID-19 in African American and Hispanic populations. We also discuss using nitric oxide as a wound agent and even in cosmetics. It's a great interview, and I definitely learned quite a bit. So without further ado, I bring you Dr. Bryan. I hope you enjoy.
So welcome, Dr. Bryan. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
So you are one of the foremost forefront scientists with nitric oxide. You're really breaking barriers as far as use of nitric oxide, et cetera. Can we back up just a little bit and you can tell me or tell us a little bit about how you got interested in nitric oxide in the first place and why you chose this as your career, basically?
Yeah, it's certainly been an interesting journey, but I've been interested in science and medicine for going back to high school. And out of high school, I went to the University of Texas at Austin and got a degree in biochemistry. There I had a chance to do undergraduate research. And this feeling of discovery really intrigued me. And so I then went on to LSU School of Medicine in Shreveport, where I got a PhD in molecular and cellular physiology. And that was in the early 2000s, right at the turn of the century, where nitric oxide had just been awarded the Nobel Prize for its discovery. And during my PhD, I worked with a pharmacologist who really did some early work on elucidating the mechanism of nitric oxide production, primarily from organic nitrates, like drugs like nitroglycerin that had been used for many, many years. And then after that, I went to Boston and trained at Boston Medical Center and the Cardiovascular Institute. And we'd made a number of discoveries even there in Boston, and did a 2-year fellowship, and then was recruited to join the faculty at UT Medical School in Houston by Fred Murad, one of the guys who shared the Nobel Prize in 1998. And so that's where it all started. By that time, we had the analytical methods and the instrumentation to detect and quantify nitric oxide. I spent really the first year just enabling patents. I had a lot of these crazy ideas that thought, well, if we can generate nitric oxide, can we actually make safe and effective therapeutics for human disease? And so that was really the first couple of years, just trying to figure all this out. We submitted a number of patent applications. And so today I have over 24 issued patents. We've commercialized a lot of that over the past several decades. And so that's really how it all started. It was when nitric oxide was really not that well known in mainstream medicine or even in the lay public. And so I think we've done a good job of, or a moderately good job of educating not just physicians, but patients on the importance of nitric oxide and really trying to integrate this into primary care. Because we know that every single chronic disease is characterized by loss of nitric oxide production, low blood flow, poor circulation to the diseased tissue. And if we can open up those microvessels and perfuse these tissues and get oxygen and nutrients, then the body heals itself. And so the body cannot heal without sufficient nitric oxide. So that's kind of our story. It's been a 20-year journey, but it's been quite interesting.
Wow. So you've been researching nitric oxide for 20 years.
That's right. A little over 20 years.
Okay. That's incredible. So I want to back up to a statement that you just made about nitric oxide being the most important thing, et cetera. I get asked this question a lot, and that is, how can I tell if I'm deficient in nitric oxide? How do you test it, or how do you know? What's the best way to figure that out?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because it's not like testing your cholesterol or vitamin D. You can't pull labs and see what your nitric oxide levels are, because it's a gas. It's produced in the body. It's gone in less than a second. So there's not, I mean, there's some stable metabolites that we do in the research lab that can give you kind of a fingerprint of biology. And that was a fundamental question over 10 years ago when we launched the nitric oxide product. How do you know if you need it? So I developed a strawberry test strip that we brought to market over 10 years ago. That apply some saliva to this test strip and it turns a bright pink. It's indicative of optimal or sufficient nitric oxide. If it doesn't turn pink, then it tells you that your body's low in nitric oxide. But I think it's a good tool to have in your toolbox, but it's not the only thing you should use. Really, the only true measure of nitric oxide production and what we call endothelial function are these devices, these non-invasive medical devices that look at reactive hyperemia. So it's an occlusive plethysmography. There's a couple of these devices on the market, but it really looks at your body's ability to make nitric oxide, and it's a measure of endothelial function. So those devices are out there. The problem is they're not commonly used. So what we do is we just look at symptoms and look at patient presentations. So if a patient has erectile dysfunction, either men or women, that's usually the first sign and symptom of loss of nitric oxide production. If you have high blood pressure, which 2 out of 3 Americans have an unsafe elevation in blood pressure, it's typically a nitric oxide deficiency problem because nitric oxide is a vasodilator. It opens up the blood vessels and normalizes blood pressure. If you're diabetic, you have a deficiency in nitric oxide because nitric oxide is part of the insulin signaling pathway. If you have chronic fatigue, that's a nitric oxide problem because nitric oxide controls mitochondrial function, mitochondrial biogenesis. So if you lose the efficiency or the ability to efficiently make ATP with oxygen, you develop chronic fatigue. So we look at really the clinical picture because really that's the best indication of nitric oxide deficiency. Until we develop reliable blood biomarkers, that's really the only way to do it.
So development of reliable blood biomarkers, or you're talking about something that's obviously not nitric oxide. It would have to be maybe a precursor or something, that we could measure.
We've seen correlations between certain biomarkers, like if you have an elevation in these inflammatory markers like urinary isoprostanes or high sensitivity C-reactive protein, those correlate with low nitric oxide. And then if you optimize their nitric oxide, you see CRP reduced, you see the urinary isoprostanes resolve. And so any type of inflammatory marker, because nitric oxide is what puts the brakes on the inflammatory response. So if you've got chronic inflammatory disease, usually we published on this in 2003 or 4, but systemic inflammation or even isolated inflammation like Crohn's disease or inflammatory bowel disease systemically shuts down nitric oxide production.
Oh, wow. I did not know that. Like throughout your whole body-wide, it shuts it down.
So any type of autoimmune disease, whether it's lupus, ALS, psoriatic arthritis, things like that. These patients, the longer they live with it, they develop systemic disease that's really can be explained by the loss of nitric oxide production.
Wow, that's incredible. I was not aware of that. So you have researched an entire breadth of nitric oxide as far as applications as well as implications in overall health and illness. I know that right now you're doing a study as far as using nitric oxide to treat COVID-19, especially in certain populations. Can you tell me a little more about that?
Yeah, and as a basic scientist, we're charged with developing safe and effective drugs or therapeutics. So we develop safe and effective nutritionals and dietary supplements. Several years ago, I started a drug company where we're really designed to develop safe and effective drug therapies going through FDA-approved clinical trials. We were going after things like heart failure, pulmonary hypertension, ischemic heart disease. But typically, drug discovery is a very expensive and time-consuming project. On average, it's 10 years and $800 million to get a drug to market. So when COVID appeared, 18 months ago, even the early data revealed that people who had underlying cardiovascular disease, ischemic heart disease, underlying kidney disease, those were the ones who got the sickest, and those were the ones who fared the poorest in terms of rates of hospitalization, admission to the ICU, and even death from COVID. So back last June, we submitted an investigational new drug application because to me it was apparent that these patients that did the worst were the ones that were nitric oxide deficient. So we got our IND approved back last June. We got the IRB approved to start the clinical trial in November. And so now we have a drug in phase 3 clinical trials for African Americans with, well, first it was African Americans because as you're aware, most people recover from COVID.
Right.
I mean, you get a better than 99% recovery from this so-called pandemic. But there are populations that are very susceptible and vulnerable to disease and death from the disease. And early on, it was revealed those were African Americans, 50 to 85 with at least one underlying comorbidity. So rather than having to enroll hundreds of thousands of patients to look at, our primary endpoints are hospitalization, admission to the ICU, and death from COVID. And in order to do that, in the general population, you have to enroll hundreds of thousands of patients. But if you take the most vulnerable and the most susceptible through our power analysis, we would need 840 patients to see a 25% reduction in hospitalization. Mm. Now we actually expanded that into Hispanics as well, because Hispanics have just as high, if not higher, rates of infection, hospitalization, and death as African Americans. So our clinical trial now is it's a 30-day study. We take patients within 72 hours of a positive COVID test and implement the therapy. It's a double-blind, placebo-controlled study. We send the patients home with a pulse oximeter, a blood pressure monitor, and then we monitor them through telemedicine. So we can actually see their progress and see their blood oxygen levels go from 78 to 95 within 5 minutes of taking their study medication. So we can actually see the patients get better, even though we're supposedly blinded to it. When your oxygen saturation goes from 78 to 95, that's certainly not the placebo effect.
Certainly. So this medication that you're using, is it an oral medication or inhaled, or what is it?
It's an oral medication. So what we've been able to do, and kind of my claim to fame, is we've made a solid dose of nitric oxide gas. And really the only way you can deliver nitric oxide gas is put it in a form that it's readily absorbed in the body. So we created an orally disintegrating tablet. And within this matrix, we designed a specific dissolution rate. So when you put it in your mouth, it'll take 5 to 7 minutes to completely dissolve. But as that matrix is falling apart, these active components come together and we generate nitric oxide gas. And that's extremely important because nitric oxide production is part of our innate immune response. And it's been shown really, I think dating back to 2005, that nitric oxide can actually inhibit the coronavirus replication.
Right.
To me, that made sense. So if you've got a patient that's nitric oxide deficient, you're exposed to the virus and inoculated primarily through our epithelial airway. And in healthy people, for instance, like me, I'm in these COVID clinics every week and I've never had COVID. Doesn't mean I haven't been exposed to COVID, just means my immune system's robust and elicits a response and prevents the virus from replicating and propagating. So in these patients that are nitric oxide deficient, they can't mobilize an immune response. Their body can't make nitric oxide. Therefore, the virus takes hold, replicates, propagates throughout the body, and they get sick. Now we're finding that these so-called long haulers have systemic disease, increased risk of blood clotting disorders, embolism, heart attack, stroke, disease, pulmonary disease that lasts long after the active virus. And that's due to the systemic inflammation and the endothelitis that results from the COVID. And so nitric oxide wipes all that out. We suppress the inflammation, we perfuse the organs, and basically prevent the virus from replicating.
Do you know if anybody has any studies on long COVID yet as far as nitric oxide, or do you have anything planned on that?
We haven't. Our IND, we just went for 30 days. That's longer than typically the progression of disease, but we just wanted to make sure that we could capture them and allow ample time to see if we did, because when we submitted the IND, there really wasn't a lot of evidence on these long haulers.
Right.
Long after we got our IND. But from a scientific standpoint and from a mechanism standpoint, it makes perfect sense that you should be able to resolve a lot of these long haul symptoms through the restoration and repletion of nitric oxide.
That's great. When we look at nitric oxide, shifting gears a little bit, there's many different applications. As you've alluded to, you're already researching and doing patents and products in different applications. Can you tell us about a few other applications that you've been working on and what you've been doing?
Well, nitric oxide is a signaling molecule. It's how cells in the body communicate with one another. It's primarily recognized as a vasodilator, meaning that it can improve oxygenation and nutrient delivery. But without nitric oxide, you can't deliver oxygen. So the red blood cell won't release oxygen until you restore the function of nitric oxide. But it's antimicrobial, as I mentioned. It's antiviral, it's antibacterial. And so we're developing topical drugs for non-healing ulcers, diabetic ulcers, pressure ulcers. Because as you know, as a physician, in order to heal a wound, you've got to do two things. You've got to kill the infection and you've got to get blood flow to that wound to allow the healing process. And in a chronic ulcer or wound, it's typically chronically infected and there's low blood supply to that wound. So our topical nitric oxide, we do two things. We create enough nitric oxide to kill the infection, and you can get the hyperemic response and flood that wound bed with blood and allow the body to repair, regenerate, and heal the wound. So we're seeing really good results with that. And I think that's a huge problem for diabetic ulcers and non-healing ulcers. There's been no innovations in wound care for the past 50 years. I mean, it's negative pressure, wound vacs, things like that. So we think this is going to be a great addition to treatment of wounds.
So as a surgeon who takes care of a lot of these wounds, how can I get some of that? Because I deal with a lot of this, and we do deal with stagnant wounds that are not healing, and it's a big burden.
Well, you know, we're going through the IND, the FDA approved clinical trials for that now, but we do have a topical nitric oxide that we positioned as a cosmetic that we see that a lot of physicians use off label based on their best medical judgment of what's best for that patient. Mm-hmm. And we do see that, you know, we see it, we've published some clinical trials on wounds, some full thickness ulcers, and the nitric oxide heals it quite nicely. We've got published data in acne, you know, it's antimicrobial, it kills the pustules and the bacteria in those pustules and basically activates the immune system to come in and clear up the acne or the dermatitis. But really, as I mentioned, whether it's neurological disease or pulmonary disease or heart disease, it's all characterized by reduced blood flow. And we see that in vascular dementia patients, you know, where there's reduced blood flow, either through SPECT scans or functional MRIs. And if you give the nitric oxide, you can perfuse certain regions of the brain, their cognition improves. So it's what we call a ubiquitous signaling molecule, and it's involved in every organ system throughout the body. You have to get blood flow to these diseased tissues or else they won't heal.
Right. Can you tell me a little more about your line of cosmetic?
Yeah, so we have a product called N101, one nitrogen, one oxygen, which is nitric oxide, but it's a dual chamber. Again, nitric oxide is a gas. And so the challenge in productizing nitric oxide technologies is how do you keep a gas shelf stable, but yet is activated when you want to use it? And so we created a dual chamber that you take one pump from one side, one pump from the other, you mix these components together, you generate the nitric oxide gas. You can detect the NO coming off the surface of the skin, but you can actually see the effects of nitric oxide working, because you'll see the skin turn pink, where we're dilating the blood vessels, we're opening up the capillaries, and we're basically flooding blood and getting this hyperemic response wherever you apply the serum. You can apply this wherever you want to increase blood flow. You know, aging skin is really just poor blood flow. And when you don't get blood flow to the cells of the dermis and epidermis, you lose hydration, you lose collagen, fine lines and wrinkles appear, cells don't turn over, and you age. And so if you can restore the blood flow to these small blood vessels and cells of the dermis, then they maintain their hydration, you get collagen deposition, cells regenerate, cells turn over, and you look younger.
So you were talking about this product increasing blood flow to the skin. It makes me think about a product that we use a lot that's been around for years, like a nitroglycerin ointment.
Right.
We use it for many things, including something called anal fissures.
Right.
How does the nitroglycerin work versus like actual nitric oxide?
Well, nitroglycerin's been around for probably 200 years, primarily for the treatment of acute angina and ischemic heart disease. But it actually works because it's metabolized into nitric oxide. But this is what's called an organic nitrate, so it has to be metabolized. So you get 3 nitro groups on a glycerol backbone. So that requires specific mitochondrial enzymes to release that nitro group into nitric oxide. And the problem with that is you develop tolerance. You got to basically cycle on and off organic nitrates, or you lose the response to that. What we do is a little bit different. We use natural product chemistry and basically recapitulate human physiology to where there's no tolerance. So we generate nitric oxide naturally without the need for mitochondrial enzymes. You don't get the tolerance, but we basically improve the body's own ability to make nitric oxide. But at the end of the day, you get the same, the end result is the same. You get nitric oxide produced, you get dilation of the blood vessels, you get capillary recruitment, and you can increase blood flow and perfusion to that area.
So what you bring up, I think, is a really important point, is that if you don't have nitric oxide kind of formed when you are either taking it in oral form or topical, whatever it is, you're dependent on your body's processes to create nitric oxide if you have a precursor. So
Right.
Kind of bouncing off of that, we talk a lot about like leafy greens, for example, making nitric oxide. Do you think that it's conceivably possible to get enough nitric oxide from leafy greens? Or do you think that this is something that you have to maybe add a supplement to ensure that you're getting enough?
Well, we published on this in 2015, just specifically to answer that question, because we wanted to know how much broccoli or celery or spinach or kale would you need to eat to get enough nitric oxide to normalize your blood pressure. And so we went to 5 cities across the US, went to New York, Chicago, Raleigh, Dallas, and Los Angeles. And we pulled these same vegetables off the shelf in Whole Foods, brought it to the lab, and we quantified their nitrate and nitrite content. There was, as much as a 50 to 100-fold difference in the nitrate content of those vegetables. So to answer your question, you don't know, because it depends on farming practices, it depends on soil conditions, and organically grown vegetables have on average about 10 times less nitrate than conventionally grown vegetables. So it's very difficult to eat enough organic vegetables to get enough nitrate that your body can then utilize to make nitric oxide. The other problem with that is you have to have the right oral bacteria. And so 200 million Americans wake up every morning and use mouthwash. So these people don't get the benefits of nitric oxide from their vegetables. And I think that's an important consideration, because I think for the most part, people try to do what's right. They think, we've been taught that you should use mouthwash for fresh breath and periodontal disease and gingivitis. But the collateral damage from that is you kill not only the bad bacteria, but you kill the good bacteria that are responsible for metabolizing nitrate into nitric oxide. So 2 out of 3 Americans use mouthwash. I don't think it's coincidental that 2 out of 3 Americans have an unsafe elevation in blood pressure. We published on that if you use mouthwash, your blood pressure goes up. You lose the benefits of exercise. I mean, I tell people, if you're using mouthwash, you have to stop, because you're disrupting nitric oxide production and you're putting your body at increased risk of vascular disease.
Definitely. When we talk about the bacteria that are present on the tongue that catalyze the conversion, is it a certain type or a couple different strains, or is it kind of most of them?
It is. No, these are facultative anaerobes. They're nitrate reducers. So if oxygen's present, and they live deep in the crypts of the tongue. So primarily in anaerobic environments. So they basically can use oxygen as an energy substrate, or they can use nitrogen. And part of that is they basically just take nitrate and through a 2-electron reduction generate nitrite that then can, and there's also some nitric oxide generating bacteria. But there's a handful of them, maybe half a dozen or a dozen of these that have been identified that we can culture and actually be able to correlate people with normal blood pressure. They have a certain number of these certain bacteria. Diversity is important. The more diverse the microbiome in the oral cavity, the better. And so that community is what keeps the bad guys at bay. And every time you use mouthwash, you disrupt the diversity, you simplify that diversity of the microbiome, and bad things happen.
I totally agree. Do you have any suggestions for people who want to build up their healthy tongue microbiome? I mean, obviously, I don't think probiotics would help because you're just swallowing a capsule.
Yeah, well, I tell you, you have to stop using mouthwash. You have to stop using fluoride-based toothpaste, because fluoride's an antiseptic as well as a neurotoxin that kills your thyroid. So stop using mouthwash, stop using fluoride-based toothpaste, and just eat more green leafy vegetables, because this is a competitive environment in the mouth. And what you want to do is you want to feed these bacteria the substrate they need, which is nitrate. So I tell people, eat more green leafy vegetables, masticate better, chew your food. That way you're basically providing those bacteria the substrate they need to respire and to repopulate and grow in numbers. And then it takes care of itself.
Moving on to exercise and nitric oxide production, I've seen it, I think, in some of your papers that you've written as well, talking about exercise stimulating nitric oxide production.
Right.
What's the mechanism behind that?
Well, that's dependent upon the enzyme in the endothelium called nitric oxide synthase. So in young, healthy individuals, when you begin to exercise, that creates some shear stress that activates the enzyme, and you get nitric oxide production because you need increased blood flow to those working skeletal muscles or the working heart muscle. And the only way to do that is to open up the blood vessels and get more oxygen and nutrients to fuel that metabolic activity. The problem is in older patients that have endothelial dysfunction, that nitric oxide enzyme is broken and it won't generate nitric oxide. In fact, that's really the basis or the mechanism of an exercise stress test. So when you begin to, as an older patient going through an exercise stress test, if you increase the workload on the heart and your coronary arteries can't make nitric oxide to dilate the coronary arteries, then you fail the exercise stress test and you're at risk for heart disease, or they'll take you up to the cath lab and do an angiogram to see what type of occlusion you have. So your ability to generate nitric oxide upon exercise is dependent upon the function of the enzyme. And in older patients, that enzyme doesn't work, and that's why they're nitric oxide deficient. So you have to do two things, and that's what we've done, is if your body can't make nitric oxide, we do it for you. But we know the enzymology of that enzyme to the extent that we can recouple it and make it functional again. And so with our product technology, you can actually then get the benefits of exercise, and you can actually activate and stimulate that enzyme to get nitric oxide produced.
What about using like a beetroot powder, or, there's tons of supplements online that you can buy that claim to increase your nitric oxide levels, and one of them being beetroot powder. How does that compare, would you say, to a lozenge of nitric oxide?
Well, the problem with beets is, and I've tested all of these on the market, 95% of beetroot products out there have zero nitrite or nitrate. So, and really that's what you need to make nitric oxide. So all of these beetroot products out there is just what I call window dressing. And there's no mechanism, those products don't work. In fact, we use those as placebos in our clinical trials because they're beetroot based, but they don't generate nitric oxide. It's a perfect placebo. So all beets aren't created equal. And then the other thing, that you have to have at least 300 milligrams of nitrate in that beet product to generate any nitric oxide. But you also have the right oral bacteria. What we've done is a little bit different. We've actually optimized that process and done a pre-conversion of the beets to where the beets that I've created and had on the market for the past 10 years, we pre-convert it to where we're not relying on the bacteria because most people don't have the right bacteria. So when you take our beet product or the lozenge, we've done the hard work for you. So when you take our products, you get nitric oxide produced every single time in every single patient.
Interesting. Very interesting. Question for you. You are very much a believer in nitric oxide and, what you preach basically and what you're telling us. What is your personal routine and regimen? Like, what do you do to make sure that you have adequate nitric oxide in your body?
It's a very good question. So number one, I stay hydrated. I drink a lot of water. That's really important. I exercise every day. I travel, usually over 100,000 air miles a year, but I make it a point as soon as I get off the plane and go to the hotel, I go to the gym and I work out, both do cardio and resistance exercise. Every night I sit in an infrared sauna. There's certain wavelengths of light that activate nitric oxide production. And I eat a balanced diet. I'm a Texan, I'm a meat eater, but I throw in some vegetables and salads. That seems to work for me. I'm 47, but I have a vascular biological age of a 31-year-old. But it's hard work being healthy, and it's hard work maintaining the discipline to eat well and exercise, especially when we're traveling a lot. But I think that works, and I don't use mouthwash. I don't use fluoride-based toothpaste. And so these things, I keep kind of a finger on my own pulse as to what's working and do routine blood work and checkups just to make sure that, what I'm doing is working. So it's worked for me. It's probably in the best shape of my life, and I'm 47 years old, despite my busy work schedule. And I do take a nitric oxide supplement because, we can't guarantee that the vegetables we eat converted to nitric oxide. So I supplement. In fact, I supplement a lot because the foods we eat don't provide the nutrients that we need. So we almost have to supplement things.
I want to back up real quick to what you said about saunas, because I'm a huge sauna advocate. And this is the first time that I've heard that saunas at a certain wavelength can release nitric oxide. Can you tell me a little more about that and specific sauna or wavelength, et cetera?
So it's the near infrared that does this. And so that energy, that wavelength can knock nitric oxide off a metal. So when nitric oxide is produced in the body, it really has two routes of disposal. It'll bind to metals and it'll bind to thiols, cysteine thiols on proteins. And so when it occupies a metal, you can basically insert certain frequencies or wavelengths that'll knock that nitric oxide off the metal and re-release it. So then you have a bioactive nitric oxide. But here's the problem. In sicker patients, your what we call photolabile nitric oxide stores are low. So if your body doesn't produce a lot of nitric oxide, then the effects of a sauna, there's little or no nitric oxide to re-release through those wavelengths. So what we do is we try to tell people, titrate up your nitric oxide levels, either take a supplement, eat a salad, and then go into the sauna, because then you're going to get a bigger effect. But I think there's two benefits of sauna. Number one is the nitric oxide release. Number two is the heat and the sweating to allow for detoxification, because most people don't sweat anymore, right? We get our air-conditioned home and get our air-conditioned cars and drive to our air-conditioned office and nobody sweats. And that's one of the major routes of detoxification. So it's two benefits. It helps you get rid of all the toxins, but it also helps you generate nitric oxide.
That is super interesting. Thank you for educating me on that.
Sure.
Dr. Bryan, I know we're out of time. Do you have maybe 5 more minutes? I can do a quick shot question from viewers from my channel, just on nitric oxide videos that I've released in the past. Okay, so we got some really quick questions, and hopefully they'll go pretty quick. Is nasal nitric oxide spray or lozenges good to fight erectile dysfunction?
Well, the lozenge is more systemic. I mean, we've done the pharmacokinetics on that. We know that we get systemic effects. We've got we've done some clinical trials on erectile dysfunction on patients taking 5 milligram daily Cialis and seeing improvement in that. The nasal nitric oxide is more local. It's a local effect. And this dates back probably 30 years when they give inhaled nitric oxide to premature babies with pulmonary hypertension. The objective was to have only a local effect in the pulmonary circulation without having systemic effects, because the last thing you want to do is drop someone's systemic blood pressure. So the nasal nitric oxide is more local. The nitric oxide lozenge is more systemic.
Okay. Is supplementing with nitric oxide safe?
Look, as anything, dose dictates the poison. And nitric oxide has two signs of toxicity. Number one is low blood pressure. So if you take too much, it's going to drop your blood pressure and you're going to get orthostatic hypotension or syncope and you may pass out. The other one, which you very rarely see, is methemoglobinemia. It'll actually oxidize the iron on the hemoglobin and reduce the oxygen carrying capacity of hemoglobin. But that you need, I mean, those are whopping doses that you hardly ever see clinically. So if you supplement with nitric oxide with products that are currently on the market and you use them as instructed and as directed, and we've tested this in pediatric patients that we've dosed with our nitric oxide technology, and we don't see any met formation and we don't see any unsafe drop in blood pressure.
Great. And then real quickly, back to what you were saying about methemoglobinemia, it ties into the next question, which is, does nitric oxide make one high? And I think that a lot of people, they confuse nitric oxide with nitrous oxide, and it can be a big issue. Can you touch on that real quick?
Yeah, although they sound very similar, nitrous oxide versus nitric oxide, they're completely two different molecules. Nitric oxide is NO, nitrous oxide is N2O, and that's the dental anesthetic that will put you to sleep and give you that euphoric feeling. The other thing is, there's these recreational drugs, isoamyl nitrite, these so-called poppers. That's the same thing, but that's a completely different class of drug and molecule. But yeah, nitric oxide, you don't get any high from it. In fact, when I take it, I don't really feel an effect. But the sicker the patient, the poorer your circulation. We find over the past 10 years that people who take the lozenge and they're really, really sick, they feel the effects almost immediately. So everybody's different.
Maybe due to increased blood flow to the brain.
That's
Just
right.
postulating. Yeah. Okay. And then last question. Any thoughts towards midfacial hypoplasia being the root cause of inadequate nitric oxide production?
You know, I think, and this goes back, and I think it's corroborated by the basic science, but any condition, it's always, no matter what it is, whether it's a, atrophic disease or whatever, it's always characterized by reduced blood flow. And that's either ischemic, where the vessels are clamped down, or it's hypoxia, where there's just reduced oxygen delivery to that. And both of those are determined by nitric oxide being produced to open up the blood vessel to resolve the ischemia, or to actually deliver the oxygen to resolve the hypoxia.
Makes sense. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bryan, for the time and for answering all these questions and educating us about nitric oxide and how it works and different applications.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's too important, and I just certainly appreciate the opportunity to come on with you and help educate your viewers and listeners.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Have a good rest of your conference.
Thank you. Take care.